Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. Welcome to today's podcast, Practical Uses of Altmetrics, sponsored by Library Journal and Plum Analytics. My name is Stephanie Sandala. I'm Associate Editor at LJ Reviews, and I'll be today's moderator. Before we go further, I do have a few housekeeping notes to run through. If you're having technical problems, please use the red Q&A button on the audience console, and the webcast tech team will get to you as soon as possible. If your screen becomes locked due to network congestion, try using F5 to refresh or Command-R on a Mac. The slide presentation is available for download in the green resources folder on the bottom of your screen. You download it as a PDF, and feel free to download it now to follow along if you have any questions. A certificate for continuing education credit is also available in the resources folder and is labeled certificate. If you have any questions or comments, please send those in at any time using the red Q&A box. Also, feel free to join us on Twitter. Tweet us at Library Journal or use the hashtag LJAltmetrics. Now for today's first speaker is Andrea Mihalik, President and co-founder of Plum Analytics.
Hi, everyone. Welcome for joining us. Today we're talking about the practical uses of altmetrics. And as I was just introduced, my name is Andrea Mihalik, and I started PlumX with my co-founder, Mike Bushman, about 3 years ago. And our goal here of why we began was really to tell the story about research and the impact it's had for those who fund the research, performing the research, or publishing it. And what I'm going to do in today's webinar is really set the stage for both Tim Deliyannides from Pitt and Robin Champieux from OHSU to talk about those uses and the way that they're using our product PlumX to begin to uncover those stories about the research at their universities. So our approach to metrics is about looking at all metrics. So all citations, usage, captures, mention social media. So when people think of altmetrics, they often think of social media, and our approach is to look at all 5 categories of this. Journal citations, as you all know, are kind of this current status quo of scholarly measure. It's all about having a journal article that has citations to other journal articles and counting that. If we look at citation-based metrics, many people think of Thomson and their Web of Science product, right? That's one set of citation metrics. And what's built on top of that are additional metrics like journal impact factor and eigenfactor. Elsevier has their Scopus product, which again, they sample a set of journal articles that they want to measure citations about. And built on top of that are additional metrics like SJR and SNP. And then Google Scholar also has their own citation metrics, which they publish journal metrics about them. If we look across these 3 different collections of citations, no one tool captures every citation. So if we look at, this is an example of citations of a book, and look at how many do these 3 different platforms collect and reference citations to this book, and you'll see, although if you go through the tedious process of looking at all of those different citations and seeing what overlap there is, it would take all 3 tools to tell the complete picture, at least as complete as any one of them are, all 3 of them are together, to get those 153 citations that you see in the middle of the Venn diagram here. And they each overlap with the other a little bit. So when we think of metrics, citation metrics, or any metrics in general, it's really a proxy for the overall use and the overall impact that something has. Nowadays, though, we can move beyond citation. So This image here, if you think of citations kind of like visible light. So for the past 50 years, all we've had to measure scholarly impact are citations. But our instruments are better now. In the modern web, researchers are going online, they're interacting with data, and we now have more sophisticated ways of picking up indicators about how work is being used, reused, and influencing others. And this is where these altmetrics or all metrics fit in to tell that complete story now that technology is caught up to be able to do that. So why does it matter? Why are these citation metrics not enough? So if you look at this timeline from the idea, the time where a researcher has an idea, they might blog about it, get a grant, and eventually do the research and write a publication, it can take from 2 to 5 years before that first publication comes out. Then after they've written the publication is out there rather, people then need to read it, do their own research, write their article, and get it published in a peer-reviewed journal. That cycle time can take an additional 3 to 5 years before you get to enough citations that have built up about that work to be able to talk about the impact that it had. So what that means is you're waiting basically 5 to 10 years from the time someone has an idea until when we get these measurable counts that we can talk about. If you look what we have now, though, when that researcher first has their idea, they might write a blog post about it. Right at the time that they do that, they might tweet about it. They might send it in email and shorten the URL. We can measure when people click on that URL. We can measure when they tweet about it. If they go to a conference, again, having their article published, they go to a conference, they present there and put their slides up on SlideShare. We can tell who's interacted with that and how many people have favorited it, how many times has it been viewed. They create data sets and share them on something like Dryad. We can tell when that data set's been downloaded. As soon as they have their publication, immediately we can start to gather metrics about the use. How many times has that PDF been downloaded? Has it been bookmarked? Have people saved it in their reference management software? And then the other types of output that are kind of invisible and that researchers don't get credit for, like say they created a video presentation about their work and put it on YouTube, we can start to see if that's been played, if that's been shared. And then of course citations don't go away. They're still a part of that overall measurement of how we can instrument all of this. So when you look at what kinds of places can you gather metrics from, you can gather them from all different sorts of where people are interacting with this data online. Also, it's more than just journal articles. We can measure and gather specific types of data about different things. So if you have a book, we can start to get a sense of where has that book been held in different libraries, government documents, clinical trials, patents, all of these different types of research artifacts that are produced throughout the research process, we can collect and gather impact about them. So what we do is we gather all of this together, and to be able to analyze it, group the metrics in 5 categories: usage, captures, mentions, social media, and citations. I'm going to do a really quick walkthrough of what each of those categories look like and what you can learn from them. So usage is the first. This is when someone has clicked on it, downloaded it, viewed it through our partnership with OCLC, whether a library holds that book, whether the video has been played. These are all good proxies for the usage. And if you ask a researcher beyond citations, what do you care about the most? Their number one answer will be, well, did anyone actually read what I wrote or view what I produced? So including usage at the article level is something that's critical for being able to tell that full picture of impact. The next category are what are called captures. Captures are when someone's interacting with research and wanting to save it for later. So this is when someone bookmarks it, marks it as a favorite, puts it in their reference management software like Mendeley as a reader, or some kinds of output. They might be watching it. Like if they have a source code repository, they're watching to see if anything is happening. And captures are very, very interesting data points, because what someone has said in a capture is, I want to come back to this later. So if it's a researcher who captured the data, and they're then going to write a paper about something, they're likely going to go back to wherever they captured it. So what we found and what research has shown is that captures are a good leading indicator to citations that have that lag associated with them due to the pace of scholarly publishing. So captures, when you look at the data as a category, give you a lot of insight into something you might care about later, which are future citations. The next category are mentions, and this is where the stories are hidden. This is where we're capturing when someone blogs about it, writes a Wikipedia article, and links in the reference section to a book or to an article that someone else has authored, comments about it, book reviews. This is where, if you can gather this data automatically and then put it in front of a set of research, you can start to discover where are the conversations and what are they saying, both good and bad. Social media, which, like I said earlier, some people think is synonymous with altmetrics. Social media does two things. One, it can tell you the buzz about the article in question. But the other thing that's really interesting, especially to early career researchers, is it starts to give them some real-time feedback on how well are they promoting their work. And then finally, of course, citations, and citations don't go away, right? They're still the standard of long-term impact, and including them side by side with these other more modern categories gives you a comprehensive view about what's happening. So what we do is, so for every article, or more generically every artifact, being able to look across all 5 categories, usage, captures, mentions, social media, and citations, and being able to gather the data about that particular article. And that acts as a building block for a lot of what Robin and Tim are going to show you in a little bit. So in summary, what we can do is we can categorize the data first. So by metrics type, the 5 categories I just walked through, by type of output, like books and articles and videos, and then based on how you want to analyze it at your institution. So as you're listening to Tim and to Robin, pay attention to how they've chosen to categorize the data, and by putting human intelligence in up front, determining how you want to start to look at things, you can get a lot more value out of it. So then once you've categorized everything, the system can go off and measure. You can gather this automatically and be able to then look at the impact at a glance and analyze it based, through analytics and dashboards to see what's happening. So in closing, there's a new way to tell a story, and to tell that story about research and impact, and look forward to Q&A at the end across all 3 of us in our presentations.
Okay, that was great, Andrea, and very informative.
Thank you.
So now we're going to hear from Tim Deliyannides, who is Director of the Office of Scholarly Communication and Publishing and Head of Information Technology at the University of Pittsburgh.
Thanks. Thanks for asking me to share some of the ways that we're using altmetrics at the University of Pittsburgh. I'd like to show you some examples of how PlumX gives us a more complete picture of how research is being used and shared in ways that go beyond just simple citation counts. But before we get started, I just want to say a few words about why we've invested in this activity. One of our primary goals is to help show impact for research produced by our own institution. So we've started by providing analytics for all documents in our institutional repository. Working with Plum Analytics, we've also set up researcher profiles for a small pilot group and we hope to roll this out to all researchers at Pitt soon. But a second goal that we have is to serve our publishing clients. The University Library System at Pitt has a well-established publishing program. We publish about 40 scholarly peer-reviewed journals, and we're doing this to support open access to scholarly research. We really intend to be transformative and to support innovation and change wherever we can. So we're delighted to have some new tools that can demonstrate impact that goes beyond just the traditional citation counts and starts to show impact earlier in the research life cycle. I just want to recap what we see as the special value of alternative metrics that we have through PlumX. And Andrea touched on most of these points, but first, we're able to put together a composite picture of many different kinds of measures. Second, we're able to track and show evidence of online behavior for the first time. And then we can also show the impact of formats whose impact has seldom been measured in the past. So here I'm talking about the content that we all have in our institutional repositories, what we sometimes call gray literature, which might be technical reports, conference presentations, or white papers. I have found it very interesting to look at the metrics for electronic theses and dissertations in particular. We haven't really had a window into this before now. Finally, altmetrics can show impact immediately as it happens. We don't need to wait the 3 to 5 years for citations to appear before we can start to demonstrate interest and uptake in the research. So on to how we're using PlumX at Pitt. We began with a small pilot for about 40 researchers, each of whom have a special custom researcher profile that gives a bird's eye view of their total impact. Then Plum Analytics began tracking every document in our institutional repository. A little bit later, they began tracking 4 of our subject-based repositories and the 37 open access journals that we publish. And I'm going to show you a smattering of examples from each of these areas in a moment. But let's start with how PlumX looks in the institutional repository. Here's an article by a team of researchers at Pitt that was published in PLOS One. So you're looking at the record as it appears in D-Scholarship at Pitt, our institutional repository. If you scroll down the abstract page, you'll see where we have embedded the PlumX widget. Each time this page is displayed, the widget is dynamically generated, and it shows current information from PlumX. You can see that this particular article is already highly cited by looking at the citation section in red at the bottom of the PlumX display. But you can also see many other metrics that show that the article is heavily used and downloaded. 81 Mendeley readers have bookmarked it, and people have tweeted about it and talked about it on social media. So for most of these metrics, you can drill down and see more detail. So for instance, the author, or any reader for that matter, can actually read the text of all the tweets firsthand. I'd like to show you some other examples from our institutional repository. In the past, we've had only very scant information about the use of electronic theses and dissertations, but I'm going to show you 2 doctoral dissertations in our institutional repository. They're both from the history department. They were both defended in the same year, 2010. And if you scroll down and look at the first dissertation, you will see that access is restricted for a 5-year period. We allow authors to restrict access to ETDs for up to 5 years. This author chose the longest restriction possible. If you take a look at the metrics for this ETD at the bottom, you'll see that it has been downloaded only 8 times in the last 4.5 years. And there are really no other signs of usage or impact. Now here's the second ETD, also from the history department, also from 2010. But this ETD was released for immediate access worldwide. In other words, it was open access. And sure enough, we find that when we look at the metrics for this ETD, we see it was downloaded 1,267 times, and it received some comment and notice on social media. So we've seen this same story play out many times, and although we haven't studied this systematically, I think with the help of these metrics, we could build the case that open access leads to higher impact and potentially more future publishing opportunities for authors. We now have over 6,300 ETDs in our IR, and through the PlumX interface, we can look at the impact of all of our ETDs in aggregate. So here's a table view looking at all Pitt ETDs in the IR. I've got it sorted by usage here, so that's the column in pink on the far right. And the counts listed here basically represent full text downloads from the IR. So you can see that the most highly used ETD is a dissertation about a wireless battery charging system that was defended in the year 2004. Because it's nearly 11 years old now, it's built up a lot of usage data. But 2004, those were the early days for social media, so there's not much evidence for social media impact. If we take this same list and sort it by social media impact, we get a very different picture. So do you notice that the records that have high impact in social media are all pretty recent? If you look at the dates in the leftmost column, you can see that these are all titles defended in the last year or two. I think it's also interesting, we can see here that high social media impact also seems to correlate with a high number of downloads. So all of this is new data that we simply wouldn't have had without PlumX. And now another example from our institutional repository. About a year ago, a team of paleontologists led by a researcher at Pittsburgh's Carnegie Museum of Natural History, who is also an adjunct professor at Pitt, published a report of their discovery of a new dinosaur, a bird-like, what they called a large-bodied oviraptorosaurian theropod. Paper was published in PLOS One. Here's the record as it appears in our institutional repository. But that same day, National Geographic got a hold of the story and featured this discovery as the chicken from hell. It was picked up by CNN the next day, and then also featured on NPR's Morning Edition. By looking at the PlumX widget in the institutional repository, we can see not only the scientific interest in this paper, so the paper's already been cited, but also the social impact of this discovery and how it captured the imagination of the general public. So these are insights that we wouldn't have been able to quantify before Altmetrics. Switching gears a little bit, I want to show you what a researcher profile looks like in PlumX. This is a way of looking at the total output of a single researcher. So in this example for Peter Brusilovsky, a professor in Pitt's iSchool, Plum is tracking 162 artifacts from Dr. Brusilovsky's CV, most of which are in the IR. You can see a breakdown of the artifacts by type, including books and articles, but also conference papers, presentations, technical reports. We also see a graphic view of the total impact of all of his works broken out by Plum's 5 impact types that Andrea showed you. Here we've scrolled down in the profile to look at the actual data for each artifact in one large table. So I've got it sorted by citation counts here, and you can see that Dr. Brusilovsky is a very highly cited author, with one paper from 2001 cited 840 times in the literature. You can also see how these highly cited papers correlate with captures. So most of these captures represent Mendeley bookmarks, and that's another great measure of really serious interest by scholars. Here I've resorted by publication date, so you can see that it's too early in the research life cycle to start showing citations. None of the 2014 publications, or the most recent publications from last year, have been cited yet, but we do begin to see other early signs of impact. Okay, now we've sorted again by social impact. So at the top, you see an article published in 2013 that hasn't been cited yet, but it has evoked huge interest in social media. So it's almost 8,000 events in the social media that are being tracked by PlumX. This is something we want to find out more about, but would we even have known about it if it were not for these alternative metrics? Very quickly now, I want to show you how altmetrics play out in some of our publishing platforms. In addition to the IR, we also host 5 other subject-based author self-archiving repositories. These are not local digital collections per se, but rather each one is built to serve an international community of scholars. We use ePrint software as the repository platform, and we have embedded the Plum widget into 4 of these repositories. Here's an example from the Minority Health and Health Equity Archive. This is a record for a federal task force report, and if you scroll down, you see that this document has had a few citations, but lots of impact in the social media. Lastly, we've incorporated PlumX into our journal publishing program. As I mentioned, we partner with scholarly societies and independent editorial teams all around the world to publish scholarly, peer-reviewed, open-access journals. It's very important to us and to our publishing partners to demonstrate the impact of these publications in every way that we possibly can. So many of our journals are small, niche publications with a small readership, and many of them are quite new. We're working very hard to build up their visibility and discoverability, but it takes time to achieve high citation rates. So we find it extremely beneficial to have a broader range of metrics to draw on. Here's an example from the journal Pennsylvania Libraries Research and Practice. We use Open Journal Systems as the platform for our journal publishing program, and we have embedded the PlumX widget into all of our OJS journals. In fact, we wrote the plugin that can be used to add PlumX to any OJS journal published anywhere. In this example, if you scroll down to the bottom of the abstract page, you see the PlumX widget at the bottom. And this article is about how libraries can use Wikipedia to increase discoverability of their digital collections. Really interesting stuff. It hasn't been cited yet, but it has gotten some interest in social media. One last example, this is from our journal, our International Journal of Telerehabilitation. And if you take a look at the metrics, it also shows downloads, captures, and some play in the social media. So these are the things I wanted to share with you today. I hope you've gotten some ideas about the potential of this new kind of information we're seeing for the first time and how altmetrics might be integrated into your service offerings and your work with researchers at your institution. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. We do have some great questions being sent in, and we will have a few minutes at the end for a Q&A. Just wanted to let everybody know. And next we have Robin Champieux, who is Scholarly Communication Librarian and Assistant Professor at Oregon Health and Science University.
Great, thank you. As was just mentioned, I am the Scholarly Communication Librarian at Oregon Health and Science University. And I've been leading our work with metrics and impact assessment since about 2013.
Before I dive into the work we've been doing, I want to give you some context about OHSU. We're located in Portland, Oregon, and we're the state's only academic health center, with schools of medicine, dentistry, nursing, and graduate science education. We're a research-intensive institution with $356 million in grants last year, and with a large portion of that coming from the NIH. And finally, while our research imprint is significant, our student and faculty counts are relatively small. In August 2013, we began what is now our 2-year pilot of PlumX. We were driven by the growing knowledge that our understanding of OHSU's research impacts was incomplete and delayed, very much like Tim explained. And this coincided with other efforts within and outside of the library to better track and benchmark research productivity. Additionally, we were interested in using Plum to capture and assess the tools different communities are using to share scientific information, to identify the specific communities engaging with OHSU research, especially clinical, public health, and lay communities, and finally to facilitate a means for assessing and communicating the impact of research contributions that are often invisible through traditional schemas. And we were very interested in helping students and early career researchers communicate their impact. So this is a snapshot of what our first year looked like. You'll see our profiled researchers down in the left, and we intentionally included basic science and clinical researchers, experienced PIs, rising stars, postdocs, and students. Additionally, we tried to target labs and individuals producing and sharing code, data sets, and other kinds of non-article research products. And so while that first year was productive and we made progress on meeting some of our initial objectives, which is, I'll save for another presentation, engagement from profiled individuals in labs was pretty low. Our outreach efforts and model use cases we discovered were too isolated and didn't connect PlumX data to points of need within the research lifecycle, especially those related to reporting and funding. I think it's worth mentioning that within the OHSU environment, only about 10% of faculty are tenure track. The rest of faculty are completely reliant, essentially, on the funding life cycle. So embedding ourselves in that was a learned lesson. What we realized there is that sort of the vision of utility of this data was lost because we weren't connecting it to these very specific points of need. Additionally, and I'll talk about this more, researchers in general attributed a lack of seriousness to the data. Metrics on Twitter activity, they said, weren't about the science, for example. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So about August 2014, we began modifying our approach to concentrate on a few model projects that speak to and address 3 major requirement themes. First, we've realized how important it is to validate altmetric data for our campus community and users. And by that I mean offering almost metrics about the metrics, demonstrating the nature and importance of the communities and activities behind a tweet count or Mendeley readers, for example. Secondly, we're trying to connect altmetric services to specific and applied points of need within the research and funding workflows, and to connect those in ways that enable researchers to tell new and better stories that can be applied to specific tasks. And finally, we're trying as much as possible to integrate both the data and the use cases within places that researchers are already going to understand their impact, and within specific points in time that they need that data, or they may need that data. So the first project that I'd like to talk about, and I'm going to highlight two projects, is our work with our Clinical and Translational Science Award Institute. And here that's called OAKTREE, which is the Oregon Clinical and Translational Research Institute. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the CTSA award program is focused on accelerating translation from the bench to the bedside. So taking discoveries and applying them to affect the health of populations and individuals, which is a very slow process currently. So it values collaboration, it values funding for specifically what is called translational research projects, and connecting basic science researchers to clinical researchers. The CTSAs as a whole have a culture of evaluation. Each CTSA has its own evaluation team, and there is an evaluation program across all the CTSAs. And much of that work is devoted to thinking beyond traditional aspects of impact and really trying to understand evidence of translation and evidence of translation to specific communities. Each year, OAKTREE and the other CTSAs have a series of pilot project funding to exceptional clinical and translational research projects. And this year, OAKTREE joined with strategic partners to leverage resources and offer awards in targeted areas like primate research and community-based participatory research. As part of these efforts and part of collaborating with other CTSAs across the country, OAKTREE was interested in gathering altmetric data on their pilot project awards. So we're currently working with them to ingest artifact information about each of the pilot project awards it has sponsored since 2006. And you get a view of that here within the Plum interface. So the graph along the top is each of the pilot project awards, their social media activity in the blue, and the number of artifacts or research products associated with each of those projects. Down at the bottom, you get some more detailed data about shares, tweaks, likes, etc. And you might immediately notice, which we did, looking at this project over on the far left, which is hard to read in this view, but it was a clinical trial that looked at the use of vitamin C for pregnant smoking mothers to look at effects on newborn lung health, both immediately and a year after birth, to see if vitamin C, which there have been previous studies that it had protective values in the lungs, if it would have a positive effect in lung health in the newborn babies to smoking mothers. This is also a view from our Plum Analytics dashboard, looking again at those pilot project awards, but this is citation data. And citation data is actually something we'll be valuing in the analysis, but I think it's interesting to point out here that that project that I just spoke about doesn't really it sort of doesn't rise to the top in this view. It's a much different benchmarking of the Pilot Projects Award when you take a look at the citation data versus the social media activity. And here is the artifact level view of the article and the research project I was just talking about. So there's actually just one article associated with this particular pilot project. Many of the pilot projects have many more than that, and various artifacts or research projects associated with it. So you get a sense here, if look a little closer, of this paper has only been cited twice actually, but there's a pretty high level of usage data, captures, and social media as well. There have been 117 tweets, or actually I should say 119 tweets about this particular article. And here I'm looking at some of the Twitter data within the context of the Plum dashboard. And below is where we start seeing the work we've been doing to help communicate and validate the usefulness and meaningfulness of this social media activity in particular. So down below is analysis that we did on the roles and number of unique Twitter handles for the Twitter activity. So you see down below the specific tweet example, but we've separated the Twitter activity into clinicians, health media organizations, healthcare organizations, hospitals, journalists, professional societies, researchers, and universities. And you get a sense of where that discussion is coming from in Twitter in this example. And I think what's another important point here is that we've actually not included, we've excluded the JAMA. This was a paper that was published in JAMA. We've actually excluded it from this view as sort of the starting point, not wanting to inflate the numbers from the activity that that first tweet would generate. Again, thinking about validating the meaningfulness of altmetric data, here we've done an analysis of tweeters by influence. The color of each box is the number of unique handles, and the size of each box looks at the number of followers or influence of that particular community of tweeters. So here you see we have a lot of activity from journalists and a lot of influence from journalists tweeting about this particular study, a really nice chunk of activity and influence coming from clinicians, healthcare media, and professional societies. And thinking about this from both Oaktree's perspective and the PI on this particular study, having this demographic data, this data that validates the raw numbers of the tweets by giving it some context and meaning has been very important and allows the metrics to begin to speak for themselves in other situations. So here are some examples of specific attention that we're seeing on this particular study. So we're seeing some evidence of prestige attention. I've chosen one example here from Scientific American that covered this study. But even more importantly, what we're starting to see is clinical attention to this particular study. So it was covered by the American Academy of Pediatrics and also Nursing Standard. So while it's too soon and we don't have evidence that this particular clinical intervention has made it into the guidelines, which we are watching, what we're starting to see is that clinicians and healthcare providers are talking about this. What's not shown on this page, which was also very interesting, is that we're seeing the study mentioned in hospital bulletins and teaching bulletins. Okay. So moving along quickly here because I'm running out of time. The next project that I want to sort of just give you a high-level overview of is our work to help OHSU researchers update their biosketch within the context of the biosketch changes that the NIH announced last May. For those of you that aren't familiar, the NIH BioSketch is essentially the CV that a researcher or principal investigator attaches to most everything they submit to the NIH for funding. Up until last May, up until the new version of the BioSketch, scientific contributions were essentially communicated with a personal statement and then a list of publications. The new BioSketch is required that the principal investigator choose up to 5 areas of scientific contribution to describe his or her impact in, and then to provide only up to 4 citations related to that specific contribution. And that contribution is articulated in a narrative format. So it really changes how scientists need to demonstrate both their expertise and the influence of their previous work. And so what does this mean for scientists? Well, that depends on who you ask. There has been a lot of attention, a lot of it not necessarily good to this change. Scientists are concerned about the work they'll need to put in to update their BioSketch for the format. They're worried about moving to what many have articulated as a sort of unfounded self-promotion versus the facts of a publication list. I'm not necessarily endorsing that view at all, but I do think it's relevant to describe the concerns that have been raised, and these concerns have been raised at OHSU as well. But mostly it just looks like a lot of work to most principal investigators, especially within sort of the tough funding climate that they're already dealing with. At OHSU, we think this is a really great opportunity to think about and to utilize Plum data in particular for helping researchers revise those biosketches and tell those narrative stories of their impact. So I have an example here of Melissa Hendel, who happens to be my boss at OHSU. She lives in the library, but she's actually an ontologist and former bench scientist. And Melissa has created her new BioSketch and described 5 areas of scientific contribution. Hard to read on this screen here, but what we've done within the PlumX interface is to create essentially a reflection of those 5 areas of scientific contribution and grouped associated artifacts by those themes. And what that allows Melissa to do, and when we work with her on this, and we'll get a sense of that in the next slide, is to kind of see some patterns of attention and impact evidence of her different areas of contribution. And again, we're seeing some interesting differences depending upon the focus of that contribution. So up on top, which are citations, the sort of the greatest bar is with community ontology development. So lots of citations for her work in that area. And that work includes not only papers, but code on GitHub, presentations, and data. Down below, you're seeing a social media story of the attention. And in this view, you're seeing that her work in scientific reproducibility is actually is showing the greatest amount of activity. And over to the left, in sort of the third bar here is the, or second bar here is the community ontology development. So 2 very different views of impact and 2 very different starting places for trying to tell that narrative story of her contribution. So I'm going to end there before I take up all of our time for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin. So we do have a lot of questions that people sent in, so I'll just go through them and Tim, Robin, Andrea, feel free to answer. It looks like 2 people asked about the measures from PlumX, if people use them for tenure review or to demonstrate your value to administrators. So I think that might be a question for Tim and maybe Andrea too.
Okay. Well, so far we haven't tried any sort of blatant activism with the data that we're producing. We're just offering it as new information to the scholarly community that we're a part of. And because we don't really own the tenure process, we're not trying to use the altmetrics as leverage there, but just make administrators and the community at Pitt aware that new information is available to them and leave the choice of how to use that to them.
Yeah, we've definitely, this is Andrea, we've definitely seen from some of our customers great stories of researchers who are trying to put together that tenure and promotion package and going beyond, especially in cases where their work may not have been highly cited yet. So one example is a researcher who was doing kind of controversial research in her field, challenging the status quo. And as she went for help to her librarian to say, hey, can you help me? This, I don't have great citations. What else do you have? They put her data into PlumX, and she was overjoyed to see that the article itself had gotten thousands of downloads from their institutional repository. And you can be sure that she put that as evidence that even though it had some citations, but people in her field were in fact engaging and reading her article, and that was something she was both surprised by and very excited to have some quantifiable evidence that her work was making a difference.
Okay, sounds great. And this is another for Andrea. Someone asked if you've reached out to EndNote so people can track downloads into EndNote online.
I would love to have data from EndNote. So yes, the unfortunate thing with EndNote is most of the installed base is not EndNote Web, but is on individual computers, and so that data is not centralized. So it's not, it wasn't built as a network-aware product to begin with, given the age of the technology there.
Okay. And this is for probably Tim and Robin. Do either of your institutions use altmetrics to compare output from a particular department with other departments at other colleges?
You go first, Tim, then I'll jump in.
In order for that to work, I think all the other institutions you want to benchmark against would need to be using a same or similar tool. And, I think Andrea would love to have all of our aspirational peer institutions be customers of Plum Analytics, but I don't see that happening tomorrow.
So we're doing a couple things in this area, and I had wished I had time to talk about some of these, but not that long. But 2 things that we're looking at and doing is, one, what I should have mentioned is the project with our CTSA on campus will actually include project data from 3 other institutions. So the CTSA here, the evaluation team, was interested in working with those 3 other CTSAs to get a sense of the sort of not only the impact stories across those different pilot projects, but also the relationships between impact on those pilot projects, and sort of thinking about the context of the CTSAs in general, where collaboration is heavily emphasized. That's also going to take place within the sort of a program of additional kinds of analysis, where we'll be looking at co-authorship and sort of subject assessment of the different projects that are happening. And it kind of speaks to that integration idea that I talked about earlier, where we really don't have success when we try to do this in a vacuum. It has to sort of fit within other questions that our researchers and institutes are asking. The other piece that we're doing is that we have a project that was funded by our regional medical library, and it's a database of research activity at OHSU that includes not only publication data, but it also includes pre-award data and award data. And we're doing text mining on the abstracts and full text when we want to apply subject understandings through various ontologies to those research activities. So then we're grouping those activities by the ontological indexing, and then we're throwing those categories of research activity into Plum to try to look at the impact data by subject rather than by person or by institution.
Yeah, I just want to say that that's a great example of the point I was trying to make early in my presentation about deciding how you want to look and group things up front, and then being able to do the analysis on the back end based on the questions you're trying to answer. And so within an institution, for example, some do group it department by department to look inside a particular institution and look at those types of comparisons, or like what you're talking about by subject, or looking at some peer institutions and building that data together. So there's all sorts of different use cases that if you structure the questions, you can then get the data to help support the answers.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Adrienne. I mean, something that we haven't done yet, but we're thinking about and we'll probably do is speaking to other systems like we happen to be a SciVal customer, and looking at how researchers and institutions and labs within OHSU are grouped within SciVal, and then replicating that in Plum as well.
Okay, sounds good. So there's another great question about, probably for Andrea, about how things are measured. So for citations, do they get a certain number of points, like citations and usage, in order to measure the metrics? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So we purposely do not give a single score to a particular artifact. So we don't say a citation is worth 100 times a tweet versus a Mendeley read versus a download. And although it's tempting, very tempting, to try to boil all of this down to a single score, if you think through even the examples we talked about today, the way you might want to look at impact is multifaceted, and you want to be able to compare and contrast. And the only way you can do that is if you have access to the raw data. And a clinician's work versus a book by a humanities scholar versus something else, boiling that down to a single number just doesn't make sense, so we don't do it.
Okay. That's very interesting too. I actually really like that also. So, okay. And someone else asked, how do you distinguish between mentions and social media? And if you do capture media from like a private Facebook post, is that calculated at all? So it's like two different questions in one. Yeah,
so we often rely on the place where we're pulling the metrics from, on how they've captured it. So we pull data from Facebook's API directly in order to get those counts. So what they're reporting exactly are what we're reporting back. So that's the level of granularity we get is what the data providers can give us. And then the question about, what was something about citations? I'm sorry.
Oh, like for private Facebook posts, if you capture information from those as well?
Yeah, so I thought there was an earlier part not about Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Whoever's question that was. Andrea at plumanalytics.com if I didn't answer it all the way. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. What kinds of training and support does PlumX provide to help people collect and analyze the metrics discussed today? Which is also a great question.
That is a great question. So we have an implementation team that works collaboratively at the beginning of, first when you're looking at PlumX and then once you're looking to roll it out. And so there's a whole set of questions about what are the sorts of things you're hoping to answer, what are you trying to get out, how do you currently capture research output at your institution, where are their good starting points, a whole set of I don't know what the right way, training on what are we doing in implementation support as we go through.
Okay. A few similar questions, like do you work with like RefWorks or Digital Commons? How you differ from Impact Story a little bit, which is also a competitor. I think we touched upon those a little bit, but if you just want to give like a brief overview.
Sure. So bpress is a good example. If someone is using bpress, they're either their institutional repository software or their selected works for looking at their research output. We can use that as a starting point because the last thing the world needs is yet another profile or yet another profile for a researcher to maintain. So using that as a starting place, we can then build, kind of a mirror site of PlumX where we can then gather metrics and display them, and then those metrics go full circle, similar to what Tim was showing with University of Pittsburgh of being able to embed those metrics directly back into the institutional repository. The same thing happens with bpress where we can embed those metrics back into the institutional repository. So where people are already depositing and already putting their work, you can then get the metrics there right in front of them to show the impact not only of the version that's inside the institutional repository, but the published version and other open access versions of it as well, all tied in one place.
Okay, great. We do have a lot more questions. I don't know if you guys want to continue or you would rather have people email you further questions. I think it's a question for like Tim, Robin, and even Andrea too.
I am fine with hanging on. Plum, I'll talk about Plum all day, every day. So I'm a bad person to ask about that.
Okay, no problem.
I think we could do a couple more questions. Tim and Robin, are you okay with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, someone asked an interesting question about articles from database aggregators. It might be the same, like similar to the Facebook answer. If you calculate those, would those article views and downloads be captured as well? I think that's a question for Andrea. Yes.
Yeah, the short answer is yes.
Okay.
We are, actively pursuing and actively have as many sources of usage as people who will work with us to give us that data. So, yes. Oh. It's the only way to answer it quickly.
Okay. No problem. And a few other similar questions. If you work with Google Scholar at all, or which I know is a popular citation site for law, and Digital Commons as well. So I think we kind of briefly mentioned that also.
We talked about Digital Commons. Google Scholar, unfortunately, does not make their data open. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so even a particular researcher trying to download their own citation counts from Google Scholar, you'll see them sometimes get blocked for accessing it too frequently. So we'd love, we'd love to have that data as another type of cited by count, but unfortunately it's not open.
Okay, very interesting. A question for Robin. It says, it appears the research office could in fact be the owner of the platform because the Altmetrics are being collected from them as a starting point. She's asking if she's correct. So, yeah, it might be a little, I'm trying to see,
I'm not totally clear on the question.
Yeah, I'm not totally clear on that one either. If someone wants to send that back in and we can clarify that one also.
Yeah, I think it might be, can the library own it versus the research office own it?
Yeah, right.
Like be the champion of something like this.
Yeah, I mean, that is right. That's a multi-layered question, and it's a very political question too. We have not figured that out yet. I would say that I think that answer and who leads the charge on that is going to be institutional specific in terms of the position and sort of conservative or sort of forward-thinking nature of the metrics your research office might be looking at, and that varies by institution. But I also think there's something to be said for the expertise that librarians and librarians bring to this. Not only what I think are some of the obvious points and are talked about a lot. I mean, this is data that we're very familiar with and understand the nuances of. But I think something that's missed when we talk about this sometimes, and this is where a lot of my work has landed, is that using that quantitative data to tell the qualitative stories requires a expert view of the literature and an expert view of mining the literature, both what is published and the gray literature, and places where impact might be important, but it is in databases, journals that we wouldn't necessarily consider, in my case, sort of the scientific literature. Mining clinical guidelines. Just the other day I had to sit down with one of our reference librarians and develop really sort of detailed search strategies to try to get at that, to sort of carry it from the number to how is it affecting clinical practice. And I think librarians have a really important role to play in executing that.
I agree with you, Robin. I also think that a very important factor is where the information systems feeding Plum Analytics sit and who controls those, which is going to vary from campus to campus, but they're going to need a source for the publication data itself that's coming from an institutional repository. Also, I think the unit that's prepared to give direct support to researchers in building their profiles, making sure that the right works are being considered and analyzed, helping people interpret the results. So, many times that is going to be a library rather than an office of research that's more focused on compliance issues.
Okay, great answers, you guys. And Andrea, do you know how many academic libraries are using PlumX?
Not off the top of my head. We're in over a dozen countries, though. I can tell you that.
Okay.
But I don't have that number. Growing rapidly.
Yep, sounds great, too. And another question for Robin. Is the work that you do scalable? She's wondering if she can do it to scale it for like a much larger institution.
Not with one person.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm being kind of flip. I do think it's scalable if it is developed as a service. So there has to be an investment in delivering it, like so many new things that libraries are doing. So I think in that sense it's scalable, but what we'll be evaluating over this next year is sustainability and scalability. I think part of the sustainability piece for us will be moving from doing this for researchers to advising them on how to do it until they get to that part where they really need the sort of the literature search expertise, sort of how we get involved with systematic reviews in a medical library setting. So I think there's going to be different models, but it's part of sort of what we'll be evaluating for sure.
Okay, great. Sounds good. And Brad just gave me the signal that we do have to wrap up, unfortunately. If anyone has any questions that we missed, please feel free to email Tim, Robin, and Andrea. We'll be happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Great.
Sounds good.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for attending. This webcast will be archived in approximately 1 week, and we will all email you when it's available. You can find out more of our webcasts on libraryjournal.com/webcasts. So thanks so much, everyone, for attending. And thank you again, Tim, Robin, and Marianne. And Andrea, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.